On the 23rd of June, 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at the Trocadero in Paris, the iconic Eiffel Tower ascending behind him in the nascent morning light. He had dedicated 3 hours to surveying the captured metropolis, his utterances sparse, his architect, Albert Speer, a constant presence at his side, diligently documenting details for the ambitious redesign of Berlin. The Führer's countenance betrayed an emotion akin to profound satisfaction. In a mere 6 weeks, his Wehrmacht had achieved what the Kaiser's armies had been unable to accomplish over 4 arduous years. France lay defeated. The British Expeditionary Force had been pushed to the very edge of the continent at Dunkirk. The conflict in the West, he firmly believed, had reached its conclusion. That very same morning, in Berlin, the atmosphere within the Wehrmacht High Command hovered on the precipice of elation. General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, confided in his personal journal that Britain's prospects were utterly bleak. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, commenced drafting official declarations of victory. The prevailing question among the German military leadership was not whether Britain would capitulate, but rather when. Most anticipated a surrender within 3 weeks. Some optimists even sooner. The reasoning appeared irrefutable. Britain stood isolated, its army shattered, its military hardware abandoned across the French shorelines. Across the English Channel, the Wehrmacht had amassed the most formidable military machine Europe had ever witnessed. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and the Luftwaffe, which had systematically cleared the skies of all opposition. What conceivable justification could Britain possess for persisting in this struggle? Even Hitler himself struggled to comprehend the tenacity of the British spirit. On the 25th of June, a mere 2 days subsequent to his Parisian excursion, he convened with his commanders at his military headquarters, situated in Bruy-Pepin, a modest Belgian village. The discourse revolved not around the strategy for vanquishing Britain, but rather the logistics of accepting its inevitable surrender. Hitler articulated his certainty regarding the eventual negotiation of terms with London, proposing that Britain might retain its empire in exchange for acknowledging German hegemony across Europe. This was not a negotiating tactic. It was a prediction rooted in what he perceived as an undeniable reality. Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, remained largely silent throughout much of the meeting. At 64 years of age, he was older than most of Hitler's inner circle, a seasoned veteran of the First World War, keenly aware of the formidable power embodied by the British Royal Navy. When Hitler inquired about the feasibility of an invasion, should Britain prove recalcitrant, Raeder's response, though measured, was unequivocally clear. The Royal Navy, he emphasized, maintained an overwhelming superiority. Any amphibious assault, he cautioned, would necessitate absolute air dominance, impeccable weather conditions, and an almost unimaginable degree of fortune. He did not declare it impossible, but his tone strongly implied he viewed it as such. Hitler, however, dismissed these concerns with a wave of his hand. An invasion, he asserted, would not be required because it would not become necessary. Britain, he was convinced, would ultimately see reason. This, he believed, was their consistent pattern. However, in London, the newly appointed Prime Minister harbored entirely different intentions. Winston Churchill, in office for barely 6 weeks, had dedicated those weeks to preparing Britain not for capitulation, but for an unyielding fight to the last. On the 18th of June, he had informed the House of Commons that the Battle of France had concluded, and the Battle of Britain was imminent. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties," he had declared, "and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." His pronouncement resonated powerfully throughout Britain, while simultaneously perplexing Germany. In Berlin, officials meticulously dissected Churchill's rhetoric, ultimately categorizing it as mere bluster, a face-saving maneuver preceding an unavoidable capitulation. German intelligence reports painted a picture of British morale in rapid decline, its government fractured, and Churchill's own position precarious. These dispatches conveyed precisely what the German High Command wished to believe, yet they were almost entirely inaccurate. The first indication that the situation was not as perceived emerged in early July. Hitler had authorized overtures for peace through diplomatic channels in Sweden and Switzerland. These informal discussions hinted at the availability of favorable terms, should Britain simply acknowledge the prevailing reality. The British response, when it finally arrived, was not a counterproposal, but rather a deafening silence. This was not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of profound disdain. The German offers were not rejected due to their inadequacy. They were rejected in their very existence. On the 16th of July, Hitler issued Directive No. 16. For the first time, the concept of invasion was officially enshrined as policy. As England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, still shows no signs of willingness to come to terms, the directive began, I have decided to prepare, and, if necessary, to carry out a landing operation against her. The operation itself was designated with the code name Operation Sea Lion. However, the phrasing of the directive betrayed a degree of uncertainty, if necessary. The invasion was thus positioned as a contingency, a threat intended to coerce British reasonableness rather than a concrete, actionable plan. Hitler still anticipated Britain's surrender. He was merely seeking to exert additional pressure to expedite that eventuality. As planning progressed, the formidable realities of what Sea Lion would entail began to crystallize. General Halder's staff meticulously analyzed the logistical requirements, and the sheer scale of the numbers involved was staggering. The initial assault would necessitate the deployment of 260,000 men onto British shores, supported by 30,000 vehicles and 60,000 horses. The crossing would unfold in multiple waves over several days. Each wave would be acutely vulnerable to the Royal Navy, which could swiftly advance from Scapa Flow and systematically annihilate the slow-moving invasion barges. Raeder presented these critical challenges to Hitler on the 21st of July. The Admiral's assessment had grown considerably more pessimistic. The Royal Navy, he explained, commanded the seas unequivocally. The Kriegsmarine possessed no battleships available for such an operation, only a meager contingent of cruisers and a handful of destroyers. In contrast, Britain could deploy over 50 destroyers solely within the English Channel, augmented by a formidable array of cruisers and battleships. The sole viable method for neutralizing this overwhelming naval advantage lay in achieving air supremacy. The Luftwaffe, he stressed, must attain complete and sustained air superiority, not merely for a single engagement, but continuously for weeks, perhaps even months. Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal of the Luftwaffe, expressed unwavering confidence in his ability to deliver. His air force had swiftly overwhelmed Poland's air arm within days. systematically swept the French from the skies, and driven the Royal Air Force from France. At 47 years of age, Göring stood at the zenith of his power and self-assurance. He confidently assured Hitler that the RAF would be decimated within 4 days, or, at most, within 4 weeks. On the 19th of July, Hitler made one final attempt to appeal to reason. He addressed the Reichstag in Berlin, his speech broadcast across the entirety of Europe. He extolled Germany's victories, highlighted Britain's dire predicament, and expressed his profound desire to avert further bloodshed. "In this hour," he declared, "I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain. I consider myself in a position to make this appeal, since I am not the vanquished begging favors, but the victor speaking in the name of reason. I can see no reason why this war must go on." This speech represented Hitler's last overt appeal to reason, and he genuinely believed it might prove effective. German propaganda framed it as a magnanimous offer emanating from a position of undisputed strength. Surely, the argument went, Britain would recognize the wisdom of acceptance. 3 days later, Lord Halifax, the British Foreign Secretary, responded via a BBC broadcast. His rejection was absolute and delivered with unconcealed contempt. Britain, he unequivocally stated, would never engage in negotiations with Nazi Germany. The war, he declared, would persist until Germany was utterly defeated. Hitler's reaction, according to those present, was one of genuine astonishment. He simply could not fathom why Britain refused to acknowledge what appeared to him to be an obvious truth. Germany, in his mind, had triumphed. The war was effectively over. Why persist in a futile and pointless struggle? Yet the struggle persisted, and through the latter part of July and into August, the very nature of that conflict began to transform. The Luftwaffe initiated preliminary assaults against British shipping in the Channel, meticulously testing the RAF's response capabilities. The outcomes of these engagements proved disquieting for the German pilots. The RAF fighters they encountered, Spitfires and Hurricanes, were both numerous and remarkably aggressive. British pilots exhibited no discernible signs of demoralization. More alarmingly, they seemed to possess an uncanny ability to predict precisely when and where German formations were approaching. The Luftwaffe had yet to fully comprehend the critical advantage conferred upon RAF Fighter Command by Britain's sophisticated radar network and its integrated defense system. Nevertheless, German pilots sensed a fundamental difference when engaging in combat over British territory. On the 1st of August, Hitler issued Directive No. 17, commanding the Luftwaffe to vanquish the English Air Force through every available means and with utmost urgency. The intensified aerial campaign was slated to commence in early August. The objective was clear: to dismantle the RAF as an effective fighting force, and thereby achieve the air superiority essential for a successful invasion. The deadline was also unambiguous. Operation Sea Lion had to be launched by mid-September to have any plausible chance of success before the onset of autumnal weather rendered the Channel crossing perilous. Göring designated the initial phase of this intensified campaign as Adlertag, or Eagle Day, scheduled for August 13th. The Reichsmarschall convened his air fleet commanders to elaborate on the strategy. Massive raids were planned to overwhelm British defenses, RAF airfields were to be systematically destroyed, and British aircraft production was to be critically crippled. The Luftwaffe, it was confidently predicted, would achieve total air supremacy within days. Eagle Day itself devolved into a chaotic affair. Inclement weather forced postponements and led to widespread miscommunications. Some units attacked, while others remained grounded. The RAF, far from being overwhelmed, mounted a fierce and determined resistance. German losses were significantly heavier than anticipated, but Göring maintained an unwavering conviction. This, he insisted, was merely the prelude. Over the ensuing days, the Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of assaults. Hundreds of bombers, meticulously escorted by hundreds of fighters, crossed the Channel to target RAF airfields in southern England. The aerial engagements were of immense scale and brutal intensity. German crews were deeply unsettled by the ferocity of the RAF's resistance. British fighters continued to arrive in relentless waves. Each day, intelligence reports invariably suggested that the RAF was on the verge of depleting its final reserves. Yet, every day, RAF squadrons bravely rose to confront the next onslaught. In Berlin, Halder's diary entries began to reflect a growing sense of unease. On August 14th, he noted the Führer's profound anxiety regarding Britain's unwillingness to sue for peace. By August 15th, he observed that the English were demonstrating remarkable resilience and unwavering resolve. Questions multiplied. Why was the RAF not collapsing? From where were all these British fighters emerging? How did they consistently manage to be in the right place at the right time? What the Germans failed to fully grasp was that Britain was outproducing Germany in terms of fighter aircraft. British factories were churning out more than 400 fighters per month, while German intelligence estimates placed British production at half that figure. This miscalculation proved catastrophic. Each day, the Luftwaffe anticipated confronting a weakening adversary. Each day, the RAF's strength appeared to be minimally diminished. By the close of August, the strain on RAF Fighter Command was considerable, but ultimately manageable. British pilots were utterly exhausted, and some airfields had sustained significant damage. But the overall defense system persevered. The Luftwaffe, conversely, was losing experienced aircrews, whom it could not readily replace. German bomber formations incurred consistent losses. Fighter pilots grew increasingly frustrated by the limitations of their Messerschmitt Bf 109s, which possessed barely enough fuel for 20 minutes of combat over England before necessitating an immediate return to base. On August 30th, Raeder convened once more with Hitler. The Admiral's concerns had intensified considerably. Even if the Luftwaffe were to achieve air superiority, he argued, the Royal Navy would still pose a monumental threat. The Kriegsmarine, he reiterated, simply lacked the capacity to adequately protect an invasion fleet against formidable British battleships and cruisers. The barges being assembled in French and Belgian ports were essentially rivercraft, slow, unwieldy, and inherently vulnerable, designed for the placid conditions of inland waterways. Within the turbulent waters of the Channel, they would be defenseless against even moderate seas, let alone the concerted assault of British warships. Hitler listened, but he seemed disinclined to absorb these unwelcome realities. The invasion, he maintained, must proceed. Britain must be compelled to acknowledge reason. If they refused to surrender willingly, they would be forced into submission. However, forcing Britain's surrender necessitated the defeat of the RAF, and the RAF, crucially, refused to be defeated. September ushered in some of the most intense fighting of the entire battle. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe abruptly shifted its strategy, initiating massive bombing raids directly against London itself. This decision was partly tactical, aiming to crush British morale and compel the RAF to commit its remaining reserves, and partly driven by emotional retaliation. German cities had already been subjected to RAF bombings in response to Luftwaffe raids that had accidentally struck London. Hitler, incensed, demanded retribution. The London Blitz commenced with 348 German bombers descending upon the city's docks and the East End. Fires raged uncontrollably across London. Civilian casualties were alarmingly high, yet the strategic effect was the antithesis of Göring's intentions. By diverting its focus from RAF airfields to urban centers, the Luftwaffe inadvertently granted Fighter Command a much-needed respite to regroup and recover. British fighters relentlessly harried the German bomber formations. The cost of these raids, in terms of both aircraft and experienced crews, rapidly became unsustainable. September 15th marked the pivotal climax of the battle. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive bombing incursions against London, committing virtually every available bomber and fighter. RAF Fighter Command responded by deploying every asset at its disposal. The aerial combat raged across southern England from morning until nightfall. By the close of the day, the Luftwaffe had sustained losses of 56 aircraft. The RAF, in contrast, had lost 29. More significantly, the RAF had unequivocally demonstrated its capacity to continue fighting, to meet any challenge the Luftwaffe could muster. The pervasive myth of German air invincibility had been irrevocably shattered. In Berlin, the prevailing mood transitioned from confidence to confusion, and ultimately to a state bordering on despair. On September 17, 1940, Hitler convened a critical meeting with his principal commanders. The sole item on the agenda was Operation Sea Lion. The paramount decision to be made was whether to proceed with the invasion, now mere days away from its designated launch window. Raeder spoke first, his assessment stark and dire. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The Royal Navy remained the dominant force. The weather was rapidly deteriorating. The invasion fleet was critically vulnerable. An attempt to cross the Channel at this juncture, he stated in carefully chosen words, would constitute an act of desperation. Göring, smarting from his failure to neutralize the RAF, offered justifications. The British, he claimed, possessed more aircraft than intelligence had predicted. The weather had been uncooperative. British radar proved more effective than anticipated. He implored for additional time, insisting that a few more weeks would suffice to complete the task. Hitler listened, his expression unreadable. General Jodl presented the unvarnished military realities. The optimal window for invasion was rapidly closing. If Sea Lion were not launched within the ensuing week, it would be impossible to initiate until the spring of 1941. The tidal patterns, the prevailing weather conditions, and the lengthening duration of autumn nights, all critical factors necessary for a successful amphibious invasion, were progressively turning against Germany. The Führer, who had stood in triumphant posture in Paris less than 3 months prior, now confronted a choice he had never envisioned having to make. Either proceed with an invasion deemed nearly suicidal by his own commanders, or indefinitely postpone it, thereby admitting that Germany was incapable of defeating Britain. Hitler opted for postponement. Sea Lion was delayed indefinitely. Officially, the invasion was merely deferred until the following spring, when conditions were expected to be more propitious. However, in reality, every individual present in that room understood the profound implications of this decision. Germany had suffered a defeat, not the war itself, not yet, but this particular contest. This critical test of wills had seen Britain successfully call Germany's bluff, and Germany had faltered. The postponement was kept under wraps for several days, but its ramifications rippled throughout the German high command. For the first time since the commencement of hostilities, the Wehrmacht had set a specific objective and failed to achieve it. The aura of invincibility surrounding the German military had been undeniably fractured. In Halder's diary, the tone shifted perceptibly from one of confidence to deep introspection. How, he pondered, had this outcome transpired? How had Britain, isolated and seemingly helpless, managed to withstand the onslaught? The answer, though the German commanders struggled to articulate it, was far simpler than they imagined. Britain endured because Britain resolutely chose to endure. Because Churchill adamantly refused to entertain the notion of surrender. Because British pilots continued to fly. Because British factory workers persisted in building fighters, and because British civilians stoically carried on with their daily lives, undeterred by the bombs. Germany's entire strategic framework was predicated on an assumption that proved fundamentally flawed: that Britain would act rationally, that Britain would recognize when it had been decisively beaten, and that Britain would capitulate when surrender appeared to be the logical course of action. Britain did none of these things. Britain simply fought on. In the subsequent months, the Luftwaffe persisted in its bombing campaign against British cities throughout the winter of 1940 and into 1941. The Blitz claimed the lives of over 40,000 British civilians and wrought extensive destruction across London, Coventry, and numerous other urban centers. However, it failed to break British morale. It did not compel Britain to enter into negotiations. Crucially, it did not secure a victory for Germany. Operation Sea Lion was officially postponed again in October, and then quietly shelved in early 1941, as Hitler redirected his attention eastward towards the Soviet Union. The invasion barges were dispersed, the troops redeployed, and the dream of conquering Britain receded into the realm of contingency planning and speculative hypotheticals. For Hitler, the inability to defeat Britain became a festering, unhealed wound. He could not comprehend it. Germany had triumphed in every battle, subjugated every opponent, and demonstrated an overwhelming superiority in military might. Yet, Britain obstinately refused to acknowledge defeat. The British simply would not behave as expected. They refused to follow the predetermined script. In December of 1941, more than a year after Sea Lion's postponement, Churchill journeyed to Ottawa to address the Canadian Parliament. He had recently returned from Washington, where he and President Roosevelt had solidified the crucial Anglo-American alliance. The war had by then escalated into a global conflict. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, and Japan had launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. America was now fully committed to the fight. During his address, Churchill recounted the grim days of June 1940, when France fell and Britain stood resolutely alone. He recalled a conversation with the French High Command, during which a French general had presciently predicted Britain's swift demise. "In 3 weeks," the general had stated, "England will have her neck wrung like a chicken." Churchill paused, allowing the memory to resonate, then delivered his response with impeccable timing and evident satisfaction. "Some chicken," he declared, his voice rising in emphasis. The Canadian parliamentarians erupted in a wave of laughter and thunderous applause. "Some neck," he added, a broad grin spreading across his face. The laughter continued, but beneath the surface of the humor lay a profound and undeniable truth. Britain had survived 1940 not through superior military force or brilliant strategic maneuvers, but through sheer, unyielding obstinacy and an absolute refusal to capitulate. The German High Command, for all its perceived military genius and overwhelming power, never truly grasped this fundamental aspect. They could not fathom an adversary who would continue fighting when such action seemed utterly pointless, who would endure when endurance appeared impossible, and who would resist when resistance seemed futile. Hitler and his generals had based their calculations on logic, military might, and rational self-interest. They had overlooked the crucial factor that nations, much like individuals, sometimes fight not because they believe they can win, but because they are fundamentally unable to bear the ignominy of surrender. Britain, in 1940, became such a nation, and in doing so, it irrevocably altered the trajectory of the war. The indefinite postponement of Operation Sea Lion on September 17, 1940, represented far more than a mere tactical delay or a strategic setback. It marked the precise moment when Nazi Germany's eastward expansion reached its zenith. It was the point at which the seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht encountered an insurmountable obstacle, an obstacle it could not overcome. This was not because Britain possessed superior strength. It did not. Nor was it because Germany had become weaker. It had not. It was simply because Britain steadfastly refused to break. For the German High Command, September 1940 brought a stark realization they had never anticipated: that sheer willpower, unwavering determination, and an unyielding refusal to accept defeat could be as significant as tanks, aircraft, and military brilliance. That some adversaries could not be intimidated into submission. That some nations, when pushed to the absolute brink, could uncover reserves of strength that no amount of rational analysis could ever predict. The victory parades meticulously planned for Berlin never materialized. The triumphant invasion never commenced. The swift and decisive conclusion to the war in the West that had been so confidently anticipated never arrived. Instead, the war ground on for an additional 5 years, consuming nations and lives on a scale that dwarfed even the catastrophic conflicts of 1940. But in September of 1940, when Hitler and his commanders convened and ultimately decided to postpone Sea Lion indefinitely, they were unaware of this future. They knew only that their fundamental assumptions had been proven false, that their certainties had dissolved into uncertainty, and that their opponent had obstinately refused to behave as expected. The United Kingdom refused to yield. The United Kingdom remained unyielding. The United Kingdom refused to cease resistance. And ultimately, this steadfastness proved decisive.
The German military leadership had subdued the majority of the European continent within a few short months. They had routed military forces, overthrown established administrations, and taken control of entire countries. Their display of martial skill was unparalleled in contemporary conflict. However, they were unable to shatter the resolve of a populace committed to enduring. A truly remarkable display of fortitude.
A truly remarkable resistance.